All right, we made it inside here. We're inside of the courtroom at the courthouse now. And in a lot of ways, it looks like other courtrooms that you would find in any state or any federal court. But I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about what differences you see between tribal courts like the Cherokee Court and others in the state or the U.S. nation.
I think we're probably one of the more westernized, the most westernized of the tribal courts in the country. One of our justices routinely works with tribal courts in other jurisdictions, helping train people, helping them integrate traditional adjudication methods into modern world. One of our justices that just retired, Justice Matlock, talked about the attorneys in Tulsa County, frequently ask him, well, is that a real court? If we come down there and we bring a case for a client who's doing business with the tribe at the casinos, do we get what's going to happen? And we can very truthfully say with all confidence that yes, you're going to get due process here and in a form that you recognize so that you can look to precedents in general jurisdictions, and that guides us a lot. Now, we're not bound by that, and we can take departure from it for good cause, and we want that. We want the outside world to look at us and say, we're not afraid to do business with that tribe. If we get into a dispute with them, even if we have submitted to the authority of their courts, we'll get a fair hearing, and they will. So I think that there's less accommodation and less difference today in a modern court than there was in the pre-statehood time when Cherokee citizens lived entirely under the jurisdiction of the tribal courts. Today, most of our citizens go for many matters into state courts because of the scattered jurisdiction of the land that we have left. And there's a good story about tribal accommodation and local rule and how Cherokees adapted what looked like on paper just almost a replica of what they saw in the surrounding states, in the frontier states. This was a story about a Cherokee couple, and the wife had gone to the district court, which the district court judges were lay people without particular legal training and functions kind of like justices of the peace for some extent. But they had a jury trial over an assault. He had picked up a big heavy book and banged her over the head with it, and she had complained, and so they had the trial. And the jury, it was imputed to them some foreknowledge of her disposition and attitude and mode of conduct, because the jury came back and said, yes, it's true. We find that he did knock her up the side of the head with that book, but since it was a great big Cherokee code book and it was done with the law, we're going to acquit because it was done with. Going to acquit. Yeah, so. And,
done lawfully in a literal sort of way.
Yeah, Professor, I don't know what that has to do with anything, but isn't it a good story?
Well, it's not a common one, to be sure. Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think it does is it suggests to us that there are still ways in which some kinds of traditional values affect how the court goes about its business. And so you've been sitting on the bench for how long now?
7 years, I think.
7 years you've been doing this.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, do you find that there are some specific sorts of Cherokee values that influence how it is you do your job?
I think that the court's made up of Cherokee people who were raised in the Cherokee Nation, and I don't think that I can articulate for you I'll meditate on that as time goes by so that I might articulate that better. But I know that all of us, we grew up here. One of the judges is a former prosecutor in the state system for years. One of them a former district judge, very seasoned. Another is a former general counsel for the tribe who succeeded his father in that position, I came to the court after 2 years in the tribal council, 2 terms, 8 years in the tribal council and another 7 or 8 as an administrator, I work for the Choctaws and Chickasaws and the Cherokees to administer the riverbed. So I'm certain that our approach is influenced by growing up here, being part of the system for many years. But
you're talking about a long history of Cherokee jurisprudence, and
our system it mirrors that in broad society, but you couldn't say it's a replica. And there are times when you'll find I remember one court about expungement of records. The question was for a candidate, have you ever been pled guilty, convicted? Well, his record had been expunged in the state court. But when it came up to the tribal court in a case of first impression, the tribal court said that expungement doesn't mean anything here. You were charged. You were. So, I mean, that's an instance that comes to mind where the tribal court said, look, that may be what the state does, but we don't do that.
And maybe it's worth clarifying for some folks that tribal courts operate, if I understand right, more or less at about the same level in terms of the hierarchy as states do. They're alongside states, but not under the jurisdiction of states unless they've consented to it. In some cases, is that right?
There are certain scattered tracts, trust land, restricted property, tribal land, like this courthouse, I think, has finally been put into trust status, but for a long time, there was a big debate. Is the courthouse on fee land? Is it under the state's jurisdiction or the tribe's jurisdiction? Because that makes a huge difference. And so we have a jurisdiction in that trust land, tribal lands that we own, and then we have jurisdiction over all these issues of employment, workers' comp, contracts that people have made with the casinos or our businesses where they have agreed to submit themselves to our courts.
So there are some cases in which non-natives find themselves agreeing to submit to native jurisdiction.
Right. There are.
Yeah.
And
that's something that I think a lot of people don't understand or know very much about. It's something I don't know a great deal about.
And it gets pretty complicated, but yes, there are cases like that. So Indian child welfare cases, sometimes those come to our district court, and they're very busy with those. And our criminal jurisdiction's limited. There was some new legislation that strengthened the tribal law enforcement, and before we could only impose a fine of so much and a year, or a year in jail. Well, now it's up to 3 and they can run consecutively and things like that. So,
and this grew out of the Violence Against Women Act, is that right?
I think so.
In part, perhaps.
You're right, in part there. And then there's another act that enhanced that, and I'm not, but...
We can Google it and then we'll
yeah, we can figure that out. We want to do the research.
All right. Well, as we have to wrap up here, I wonder if there's anything that you feel like people in general ought to know about how it is that tribal courts do their work. What misconceptions or lack of knowledge do you feel like we need to try to address?
In jurisdictions in other tribes, they are wrestling with, as the feds have said, okay, we're going to give you back some authority over non-Indian offenders who come into your jurisdictions. But with that, giving them again what they had at one time, that comes with strings. Indian Civil Rights Act. For instance, in Wisconsin, they were wrestling with the problem of how do we do that? If someone assaults an elder, that elder doesn't have to suffer the indignity to come to court. That can be prosecuted without that. But if you bring a non-Indian in, he has all the Civil Rights Act apply to him. Right. So then you have to drag the elder in to be cross-examined and so forth. And so those kind of issues, then the tribal court is torn between, do we accept this additional authority and give up? And how do we integrate this little bit of more authority back into because some of the jurisdictions really don't like, that they want to be, work on conciliation and bringing harmony back. They don't like to have an armed person in the courtroom, which we routinely do. So I think that other tribal jurisdictions are having more problems wrestling around with these issues than we are.